So thank you so much, YB Fahmi, for coming onto the show. I'm really happy to have you, and I've been following you for the last few years, and I've been really inspired by the things that you've done. Um, I first of all wanted to start by asking you about COVID-19. So I wanted to know how it's affected your constituency and whether certain communities in your constituency have been hit worse than others.
Thanks, Ishan, for inviting me. The this novel coronavirus, COVID-19. Of course, there is an epidemiological aspect to the impact it has on most communities in Malaysia, in Lembah Pantai notwithstanding. And from a health perspective, what we're seeing is, thankfully, Lembah Pantai itself is not a red zone, but the district of Lembah Pantai, comprising of 3 parliamentary constituencies, namely Lembah Pantai, Seputeh, and Bukit Bintang, is considered, or was considered, a red zone. I think it still is as a district, mostly because of the certain clusters, the Tabligh cluster in Sri Petaling and the foreign workers cluster in Masjid India. But Lembah Pantai itself is some parts are green, some parts are yellow. We do have some active cases in Lembah Pantai. So in Lembah Pantai, we have the University Malaya Medical Center, which is a COVID-19 hospital. And one of the impact of having this hospital within the community is that a lot of people who work at the hospital, who are frontliners in the hospital, live in the community. So we've had several instances, several positive cases of COVID-19, where the spread is via the workers from that hospital. And it goes into the community. But thankfully, the reach has not widened beyond the specific family. It does create some worry. And I think a lot of people, because of lack of information, they either have some kind of phobia or have some kind of stigma towards those who have or are thought to have COVID-19. So anytime, Lembah Pantai is, according to Department of Statistics, there's 176,000 residents. So anytime, it's not huge, but it's not small either. And certain areas are quite densely populated. So anytime something happens, word gets around very quickly. And when you have an ambulance coming by with workers dressed in full PPE, of course, people are going to be talking, what's going on, who was the person involved, are they positive, are they going to die, are we going to die? So it gets quite panicky quite quickly. So from a health aspect, this is a concern. From another point of view, there are 2 major issues that I've noticed. That those who live in public housing projects or low-cost properties, they are hit harder than most because, firstly, many don't have sufficient savings to tide them over during the movement control order that began on 18th of March and is supposed to end on the 9th of June. On top of that, many are daily rated workers, so they are paid on a daily basis. They might be involved in the informal sector, or they might be day laborers. So when there was no work for them, then there will be no pay. So you have a situation which you can see is quite calamitous, because oftentimes these families can be quite big. So 6, 7, 8 per household, small 600, 650 square foot home. And oftentimes you have one breadwinner. So when that breadwinner does not have work, so everyone is just trapped in the house. And what we have been doing is try to provide some kind of support, sending food, sending aid of various types, kind. And that at least helps to tide them over. It does not answer the question of whether they will have any work going forward. Those who are barbers, those who are who work in specific areas that involve a large gathering of people, people who work in restaurants, for example, people who work in hotels. So most of the people who are in these sectors are hit harder than most. Some of the residents that I meet, they work in hotels, and then they say either they, they used to work maybe, 4 weeks a month. Now, going forward, maybe 3 weeks a month with a pay cut, or they may not have been getting pay since March. They don't know whether the hotel is going to be around 3 months down the line. So there's a lot of uncertainty. And so jobs, work, that is a big problem. The other one is education. So there are 5.4 million students from standard 1 through to form 5, form 6 in both government and private education system. And throughout the period of this movement control order, we've seen that the Ministry of Education has not been so proactive in addressing some of the problems around access to e-learning. They've relied on either things like Google Classroom or giving work through WhatsApp. So they would have to print them out and then send that back. So a lot of the households, particularly those who live in low-cost housing or in PPRs, they have little access to equipment, to internet. So that makes it doubly difficult for them. And there's no schedule. They ask parents to let their children watch TV Pendidikan or education TV. And that in itself also is problematic because of the content. So I see another major issue, which is education. We've not even spoken about issues around mental health, but I'll leave it at that first.
So coming back to jobs, I understand that Lembah Pantai has set up a job center of sorts. So maybe would you like to talk a little bit more about that, and what are the problems or the jobs that you see going away, and what are some of the jobs that you see becoming more prominent, or what people should look for in the future?
Yeah. So the idea of a job center started actually sometime last year. I, as a parliamentarian, became quite interested in the question of the future of work, and trying to see what kind of government policies are in place, need to be in place to prepare the Malaysian workforce for jobs in the future. Unfortunately, COVID-19 happened, and that kind of really cut things. It was a great disruptor, and we're seeing jobs disappear much faster than anticipated. So I think the last report from the Department of Statistics indicated that over 1,000 jobs have been lost. So, but whether these jobs are lost permanently or they will be returned later, it's hard to say at the moment. So the idea of the job center really is to not only from the back end look at data and ask questions around the future of work, but also to provide a very practical solution for residents in Lembah Pantai who are looking for work. And I was thinking if in terms of food and that kind of a food supply chain, we can talk about buying local, eating local. In certain countries, that's the fad, right? So the zucchini that you eat is grown behind somebody's house. The restaurant has its own farm within a certain vicinity, so it's environmentally friendly. Why not apply that to jobs? And what kind of jobs would be suitable for this? So the idea of a job center is also to try and get businesses on board with the idea of hiring local. You see that a little bit more, but not local as in like Malaysians alone, but also local as in within, say, for example, a 10-kilometer radius of their business. And I was hoping that a job center would be able to facilitate some of this. Unfortunately, because of this movement control order, as well as the recent change in government, so we've had to change the concept a little bit. Right now, it exists only online, and perhaps once the movement control order is lifted, then we can look at a proper functional physical space. So it aims to do three things. One is job matching between employers and people who want to find work. Secondly, it's about education, either retooling, reskilling, upskilling, providing workshops, even talks, webinars about certain skill sets or certain direction that things are going. People who are interested in coding, for example, yeah, and to have that space to allow people to come and do that kind of work. But the back end is really research. I'm interested to look at what are the kind of laws that we have right now that might be considered obsolete. What are the kind of what the guidelines, policies that need to be in place to better prepare Malaysians for the future. In Parliament, I've been fighting, for example, for a lot more support for angel networks, angel investors, particularly those who are interested to really provide, like very practically fuss-free grants to technopreneurs in exchange for equity, so that they can really move from bootstrapping to Series A funding, this kind of thing. So looking at startups going forward, my suspicion is that there will be more migration online. Of course, some type of activities can only be done transacted in person, but I think it should not stop us from innovating and looking at novel solutions. In fact, this PKP, this MCO period, particularly during the month of Ramadan, provides a very interesting opportunity to test certain business models that probably can only function online, related to F&B. And also, when you think about it, why do you really have to go to a bookstore to pick up a book? Really, it should just be through several clicks, and within a day, or if not within a couple of hours, the book arrives at your house. Same goes for medical supplies. Perhaps pharmacists can look at enabling some kind of authentication through TAC, or some kind of blockchain technology that ascertains the person who's placing that order has the prescriptions, and then can place the order and it gets sent to them. Going to physical places now is a risk, and that will remain a risk probably within the next 12, 18 months until we find a vaccine. And even then, it's not a surefire protection against COVID-19. So I see ultimately the research that comes out of this job center, I'll take to Parliament as well as to the public, in the hopes that we can change some mindsets, both among workers, employees, employers, but even among policymakers and lawmakers.
So coming back to, you mentioned earlier that there's been a change in government. I was wondering how aid has been affected in different constituencies, based on the fact that the government now controls a completely different set of constituencies from what it did a few months earlier. Have you been affected by the changing constituencies, by the changing government? Sorry.
Yeah. So on the one hand, certain government agencies, they have been, how do you say, when they used to be more proactive, now they're a bit more wait and see. Some untold, for example, the welfare department, they were very helpful to some of us, but because they were helpful, there was some kind of political retribution that happened to them behind the scenes. So we know about people being transferred, people being moved here and there. So that kind of political vendetta behind the scenes against those who appear to be helping those of us in the opposition, that very ugly trait has happened again. We limited, when we were in power, any kind of change because of political vendettas, across the board. Now there appears to be wanton change, and so a lot of people in civil service, they become a bit more guarded about how they come across to help. They're still professional, but I find that if previously they used to be very forthcoming, very proactive. Now, if we ask, maybe we'll get an answer. But having said that, when it concerns things related to constituents, to the poor, people who are like downtrodden, usually they will still assist. Of course, during the MCO, there was a question of these food baskets that were supposed to be distributed to the
And that was
communities.
something I was wondering about, because I read a Malaysia Kini article where you mentioned that they were advertising them at 100 ringgit, but they were actually not worth that amount.
Yes, and the problem was, they said that most of the food had to be packed and had to be transported. So the transport cost and packing cost all in cost about 15% of that amount. So whether that is legitimate or not, my thinking is, I think 15% is quite high. For example, my constituency, my office, just to give a figure, we recently worked with, say, about 1,000 food packs. So wait, and when we were looking at the cost, maybe in terms of putting things together, getting the lorry to transport the material, doing the packing, and also moving, maybe it costs about 10%. So 15% is a little bit high. And the problem was that in government, actually you have a lot of government machinery to help move. So that would actually cut costs down, cut costs. So actually, my thinking is that they could have spent maybe just 5%, for packing and transport and stuff like that, not 15%. That's quite
So do you
high.
think the main issue is transparency on the part of the government?
Yeah. If Parliament were in session, originally we were supposed to have met on the 9th of March. That was when the session was supposed to have started for this year. A lot of these questions could have been put to ministers in Parliament, and they would have had to answer. And we would have known, we would have queried why it would have cost so much. Now we have to wait until July. So we don't want people to forget the issue, because the amount, in total was about 22.2 million. It may not seem like a lot, but when could you have spent more? Could you have given more families, for example, in this time of crisis, instead of paying for these kind of costs? So it goes back to the function of Parliament as to provide oversight and to provide checks and balances through the executive. So even when I was on the side of government, I was not in government, and I was still quite critical of my colleagues who are ministers. We don't see that level of criticism or criticality among MPs in the government bloc today. Those who are seen to be more vocal, they may be given suddenly some kind of a post, and then everything goes quiet. That seems to be the trend, unfortunately.
So I was wondering if you had any thoughts on the decision to just limit Parliament to just the King's speech and not allow the motion of no confidence to go on and to debates to take place.
Yeah, it's evident that they don't have the numbers, and they're worried about that. And the fear is, even if they say they have a certain amount of members of Parliament, when push comes to shove, if there was a secret ballot, for example, you may not have those numbers. And I think the Prime Minister is cognizant of the fact that he's trapped between a rock and a hard place, because you have on the side of Pakatan Harapan, he has to face Tun Mahathir. On the side of Perikatan Nasional, you have Barisan and UMNO that have stated explicitly that any kind of cooperation is limited until GE15. So we have a small by-election coming up, Don Chini, in Pahang, under Pekan constituency, and that was an UMNO stronghold. So what happens there vis-a-vis Bersatu will indicate the landscape that and also the psychology that is confronting or afflicting the Prime Minister at this point in time. My sense is that the real fear, of course, has to do with the motion of no confidence, but the practical effect of not calling the session of Parliament is that not only do they not get to pass certain supplementary bills, that is to provide for the 22 billion ringgit worth of support that the government has said it would pump in, or rather reappropriate from various ministries. We also have this issue of contractual arrangements where maybe the force majeure clause may not apply. So if we were able to table a COVID-19 bill like what has happened in Singapore, certain issues related to contracts, people who may not be able to pay their rent, they're not evicted during this time, that can be quickly addressed. In fact, it should have been addressed probably at the start of March. Today, we've seen how Singapore, UK, the US have changed their respective houses of representatives in order to either have remote sessions or even remote voting. So the House of Congress today, on the 15th of, today is the 16th.
16th. Yeah, I think they met
16th of May. Yeah. So they met early this morning, our time.
Yeah.
And they passed they passed a motion to enable remote voting for their members. So that's quite novel, and that's quite for a democracy that's been around for over 2.5 centuries, more than two and a half centuries. I think that is a novel innovation. So there was the argument that we can't sit because of COVID-19, and we can't see ourselves in the same light as Singapore, the US, and UK, because those countries have done it worse, have got, the COVID-19 situation in those countries are worse. But the question really is, because we have been so capable of handling and COVID-19 and flattening the curve, so to speak, we should also be at the forefront of innovating novel solutions when it comes to Parliament and such. Unfortunately, that's not the case. And so we see all of the arguments laid by these, whether it's the Minister in charge of Parliament, Takiuddin, or cyber troopers on the government side, or even other MPs from the government, it's unfortunately, they're very weak. And people generally right now, our assessment is that the Malaysian population is seeing, you can open restaurants, you can open a lot of activities are back on track. Why not Parliament?
Yeah, so I agree. I think that's very much the sentiment amongst Malaysians. But going back a lot more, prior to GE14, I understand. So you were put to contest Lembah Pantai after Nurul Izzam moved to a different constituency, and you were facing a BN politician who contested there before and had come close to winning. And on top of that, you were faced with this redelineation, making your constituency a lot more competitive for you. Why did you decide to run, and how do you think you won? What was the message you think that convinced voters who were not likely to vote?
Well, the party was the the party decided on who ran where. So because Malaysia, we use the Westminster style parliamentary system, so parties, people participate on a party, not party list, but on a party ticket. So you can't run away from what the party decides. So the idea that I chose Lembah Pantai, well, the party chose me for Lembah Pantai. Of course, I made some argument for it. I've been working in Lembah Pantai for a while, so perhaps some people felt that it was a natural choice. So I was lucky But at the same time, I've been working in Lembah Pantai since about 2010. So a good 8, 9 years. Also, I had done some volunteer work in Lembah Pantai in 1999. So it goes back quite a long way.
Yeah.
And with the redelineation, of course, a lot of people felt that, putting a newcomer would be low risk. It will be a low risk move rather than putting a senior figure. And of course, Nur Izzah went to Pematang Pau. There was some reconfiguration. And I think, a lot of people felt that Lembah Pantai was very difficult to win. Many felt that, I'm wasting my time. I'm a newcomer. I should go to a safer seat. But I stood my ground. The party stood its ground, the leadership, and they put me in Lembah Pantai. I was very comfortable working in Lembah Pantai. And we had, I would say, some of the key strategy that we had was to bring in certain former UMNO leaders to come and campaign with me in Lembah Pantai. Yeah. So the most interesting, figure who came, of course, there was Tun Mahathir, but there was also Tun Daim Zainuddin, who in GE 13 campaigned against Nurul Izzah. Yeah. So in GE 13, this 5 years prior, he was campaigning with the person who campaigned against me, contested against me in this election. So that was quite interesting. And I think for people who saw that, I think they must have been quite, hey, this is quite interesting. Of course, Tun Mahathir and Rafidah Aziz came to help me. Yeah. And there were also other civil society leaders like Ambiga, Marina Mahathir came to speak. My mother came to campaign for me. So it was quite an interesting campaign season, campaign period. But I think at the same time, there was a lot of disenchantment within UMNO. And I think there were people from UMNO who probably kind of either they left, or there were people who were in the middle, who may have leaned towards UMNO, but when they saw Tun Mahathir being on the side of Pakatan Harapan, they sided with Tun Mahathir. I don't think we will see the same situation again in GE 15. So then at that time, the configuration of variables will differ. But for what it was worth, I was a David. It was a Goliath, a Goliathan enemy, nemesis, But I think we felt the situation change halfway through when I think there were people who came up to me. They would say that they're with the police or they're with the army, and that they said we support you as voters. So I felt that there was some change happening on the ground.
And so I have two more questions. So the first one is, what has disappointed you the most over the last few months looking at the political situation in Malaysia?
Yeah, of course, the change of government is very disappointing, not least because it was triggered by people who had betrayed the cause, people who were traitors to the reform movement. We were, of course, I feel in the last 2 years, we were not pushing reforms as quickly as how I would have wanted. Many of the low-hanging fruits should have been implemented much sooner. We should have plugged them much sooner. Putting in place a limit, a 2-term limit for the Prime Minister should have been among the first things that we did. Yeah. We don't know whether even the reducing the minimum age for voting to 18 will see the light of day. It has to be gazetted. It hasn't yet been so. We're hearing maybe sometime in June, but let's see. On top of that, we were hoping to push through the IPCMC to manage both perception as well as somewhat discipline within the police force. So that probably won't see the light of day. So I'm disappointed in what had happened, not least because the reforms that we had been pushing for are all stalled for the time being.
And my final question is, where do you see the future of Malaysia politics going? Maybe specifically in relation to the next election.
I think we'll see a lot more younger politicians contest. I think many more older politicians may not be participating so much. When you look at, say, Tun Mahathir, he will be 96, 97 by that time. And it's not an easy thing to contest at that age. I think we don't know whether there will be other politicians who may call it quits. And my sense is that probably several younger MPs may either they may be moving around to different constituencies, or they may strengthen their base in those constituencies. But probably the biggest change will happen once we know what Bersatu, what happens with Bersatu.
Yeah.
So we're hearing that Bersatu's party elections will take place sometime at end of June.
Yeah.
Whether it does or it doesn't, we have to wait and see. I think definitely for PKR, for Pakatan Harapan, right now, our thinking is that Dato' Sri Anwar will still be the candidate for Prime Minister if he's not the Prime Minister by that time. And I think hopefully we'll see a lot more young voters come out to vote. But the fear is that we may not see the same kind of enthusiasm that we did in GE 14 because the sense of betrayal among the electorate from these people who they were voted on as to be part of Pakatan Harapan, and yet they switched. So I believe one of the key things that we have to work on is building a consensus for an anti-party hopping law, like what's in place in Penang. So it's really hard to guess what shape or form GE 14 may take, because it's still, we're about halfway through. There's several possibilities. One is that there's a change of government before long. Two, there's a general election, there's dissolution of parliament and general election, say within the next 1 year. And three, we wait until end of the term. So that's about 2022, 2023. And a lot can happen between now and then. A week in politics is long, a year, what more?
Yeah. Well, thank you very much, YB, for coming on and answering my questions.
Thanks, Ishan.
I think it's really, really interesting, your opinions. And as someone who spends a lot of time in the Lembah Pantai area, and even before the elections, I attended some of the rallies outside Bala's Banana Leaf. I've been really inspired by the things that you've been doing. So thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
Right.
Take care, Ishan.
Bye.
Bye.